Welcome to Women's Work, a series about the working lives and literary works of U.S. women. In this series, we take up questions like where did Americans get the idea that some kinds of labor are properly women's work? How is work gendered in women's literature, women's work or works in another sense? How are female writers and philosophers recasting what it means to do meaningful work? I'm your series host, Chris Hedlund. I teach in and help direct the Sheedy Family Program in Economy, Enterprise, and Society at Notre Dame. The program helps students who are studying both business and the arts, humanities, or social sciences to ask big questions like what makes work meaningful or what makes a just economy. This Think ND series is based on an undergraduate course I have developed by the same name, Women's Work. Both the course and the series are made possible through the support of ND Women Connect, Think ND, the Notre Dame Alumni Association, and a digital learning sprint grant that I received through Notre Dame's Office of Digital Learning and their campus partners. If you find the content here interesting, I hope that you'll consider interacting with the Women's Work course in other ways, such as volunteering to do an informational interview with our students or participating in our shared read program in conjunction with the alumni group Notre Dame Women Connect. You can find out more about these opportunities and others through the Think ND website. Okay, let's talk about women's work. I am so pleased to be joined today by my close colleague, Dr. Paul Blaschko, assistant teaching professor in philosophy, co-author of the book The Good Life, and director of the Sheedy Family Program, the program in which, as I just said, I also work. Paul, thank you so much for being here.
No, it's such a pleasure.
Yeah. So, audience, I've asked Paul to come here today to talk with me about work that feminist philosophers are doing to help all of us, not just women, rethink our approaches to big questions. I mentioned a couple of those big questions already. So, what makes work meaningful? How do we avoid burnout in our lives? So, Paul and I are going to talk through today a little bit about that feminist intervention in the philosophy of work, first on its own, and then at the end, a little bit about through a story, given that we're thinking a little bit about literature. Paul, again, thanks so much for being here. Before we jump into the details, if you're okay, I'm going to just ask you a couple of broad questions about you. Okay, good. So you're a philosopher. Tell us, what does that mean?
Yeah. So a philosopher is somebody who thinks and uses experience, everyday experience, to form a picture of the world. Now, there's different subfields we can think about. How do we know things? Or we can think about what exists and why. These are kind of big questions, what you think about when you think about the history of philosophy, Aristotle, Plato. But really, that's it. We use any sort of evidence or experience in arguing for a particular view. Our methodology is embarrassingly simple. It's just thinking, like reading, thinking. So I would say, yeah, that's maybe how to capture it best. Just to give a little bit of context for this conversation, the thing that we're most often doing as philosophers is making arguments. We're saying, look, work is meaningful when the following conditions are met. And then we give those conditions. And then we argue about those. We say one of those conditions doesn't seem necessary, or it seems like this condition is actually the whole answer. So we're often going back and forth, kind of giving arguments, trying to get at the truth of whatever it is that we're considering.
Yeah, I've always really appreciated when we've taught together and you help students think through, here's the premises and the conditions and the argument. I know I always find that really helpful for my own thinking too. What would you say then your kind of sub area within philosophy is the philosophy of work? Like I've heard you describe yourself as a philosopher of work. So what does that mean then?
Yeah, broadly, I do virtue ethics. I think hard about what it is to be a person, what it is to be a good person. Are there general sort of ways that we can characterize what it is to live well, what it is to be a good person? And work is just a huge part of that, right? It has been throughout all of history. I mean, you can't really imagine a society where people don't work, or at least you can't imagine one yet. And so in the contemporary world, work is part of our identity. So many of our values are bound up in it. So it's a huge part of what it means to live well, what it means to live a good life. And so my kind of subfield within virtue ethics is the philosophy of work. And there's a bunch of questions that you can ask in the philosophy of work. You can ask one, what is work itself? Can we define it in some way? What distinguishes it from other activities like play or leisure? It might seem obvious, but then you start thinking about it and you say, some people run marathons for fun. That's a lot of work. So shouldn't that count as work and not leisure? Does all work involve getting paid to do something? Or what about people who are working the land to raise crops to eat? They're not getting paid. That's just one question, just a definitional question. What is work? And then we get into all kinds of other questions. What makes work meaningful? Should we value work in the way that we do in contemporary society? We seem very caught up in the sort of status and power and wealth that can be generated by work. Is kind of taken center stage for a lot of us in our lives. Is that a good thing? Or is that kind of a sort of historically unnecessary thing, but a way that our culture has grown up? Should we critically interrogate that and think about that a little bit?
So you teach a class called The Working Life. Are those examples of the kinds of questions then that you study in that course?
Absolutely. So we start just by trying to define work. And so we consider a couple of different views, give these definitions. But as soon as we do that, we dive into these questions about value, right? What is good work versus bad work? What is work that lifts us up and empowers us, that we find meaningful versus work that oppresses us or that feels like toil or drudgery? A lot of my students come into the class with this question of how am I going to find meaning and purpose in my work? And that's really how I advertise it and how I talk about it. And it's where I started when I started thinking about the philosophy of work. But about halfway through the semester, we try to take a step back and start asking, should we be looking for meaning and purpose in our work? And I think the answer is sometimes yes, and in some ways yes, but we need some critical distance because it's easy to kind of get sucked into this view where work is everything and just to fail to realize that we can find some of the things that we're looking for in work, meaning, purpose, happiness, outside of kind of the traditional workplace. So throughout the semester, we kind of make things more complicated. And then by the end of the semester, my goal is for students to be able to really articulate in a nuanced way their own philosophy of work. Here's why I think work is good or what kind of work I think is good. Here's why I want to go into this industry. It can get really concrete, but overall, here's the role that I want work to play in my life. Here's how I'm going to try to integrate it into my life and who I am as a person so that they've got that as a baseline, right? As they kind of then go out into the world and actually enter the working world.
Yeah, I can see why that would be so important for students at that, especially at that phase of life where there's so much focus on work and like getting the professional accolades and you take the classes so you can get the job. But then to think for a second to kind of zoom out and put that job in the context of a meaningful life. What does that look like? And like, how do, what do you want the relationship between your work and everything else you are as a person to be? So I could see that'd be important.
Yeah. And I can even share the thing I love to do in my work, the sort of research work or scholarly work, but especially the teaching work I do is I like to look at questions that are really puzzling for me that I have not figured out yet. So when I started teaching this class, when I started designing it, I was in much the same position as a lot of the students that I see are in now, right? I found my life a little bit unintelligible. I thought, why am I working so much? Why am I sensitive to the kind of dynamics of the workplace? And my self-esteem is tied up in whether I've published this or succeeded that way. And I wanted to kind of think my way through and think my way out of the unhealthy patterns and into leaning into the healthy patterns. And so for me, it's just such a rich experience just walking through the sort of narrative, the arc of this course over and over. Every time the students are seeing things that I didn't see, I just feel like, yeah, it's just such a gift to be able to teach a class like this, where every year I just get a chance to kind of re-examine, check out where I'm at with all these questions.
Yeah, as you were talking, I just was like, oh, yeah, isn't teaching a gift? And then you said that exact thing. I feel that same way.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's really a beautiful thing. Yeah. I want to ask us, so this is called women's work. And so I'm going to narrow it a little bit on, I know that gender is a variable that shows up in that course, as well as you were generous enough to share a chapter from a book project that you're working on currently that had to do with women's work. So can you give me a little bit of an overview? Like, what are some of the questions or debates that are interesting to you as you think about the intersection of gender and the working life?
Yeah. So I would say there's a very specific kind of question, and it has a really interesting history in feminist thought that really interests me. And that is, how do we balance our work life with our personal life? That we even divide things up that way, I think we need to remember is kind of a contemporary phenomenon. If you were in a hunter-gatherer society, the boundaries between work and leisure, work and community, they were just a lot more blurred. It's not like you went to the office and gathered berries, came back, and then, okay, now I'm home. Now it's my personal life. In the contemporary world, it very much is like that. We have workplaces. We go to a place. We have work relationships. We have our professional identity. And then we've got this whole other thing, our personal life, the thing that we do on our time off when we're not working. The central question for me is, how do we balance that, right? And this is just really a philosophical way of asking the question, how do we achieve work-life balance, right? We all think about this. And what's interesting to me is that is really difficult. It's a really tough puzzle. And it shouldn't be, right? The way that I think about it, okay, work takes a certain amount of time. And if we outline in our job description, okay, here's my duties, here's the time, here's when I'm going to be doing this. Okay, and then I'm going to balance this with all the things that I value and want to do with home. We should pretty easily be able to kind of balance those out. And if we find that, okay, this is taking more time, you know what? I'm going to take this responsibility off my plate if I can, or I'm going to take a step back or do something else. It seems like we should be able to balance this things pretty easily, but we definitely can't. I think all of us know it's just very tough. It's a very tough problem. So I started thinking about this in terms not just of kind of a practical or strategic problem, like how many hours should I spend at the office versus how many hours should I spend at home, but really as a tension in the values that are at play when we're thinking about professional success, work life, and flourishing as a person in a broader sense, right? Okay, so the question that I find really interesting from the history of feminist thought is, how should we value domestic work? And domestic work, I think, has certain connotations even today. We think, okay, I know what domestic work is. But if you start thinking about, again, the history of thought here, domestic work, the work of a home, the work of maintaining a home, has taken on very different forms throughout history. At the very beginning of recorded Western thinking on this, philosophical thinking about this, that was called economicus, right? The economy, tending to the economy of the home. And that was a kind of private sphere in a way, but it was much more political and socially nuanced than we might have thought, right? Managing a household, economicus, this requires you to be making sort of decisions about goods and distribution of these goods, relationships and who deserves what. If in the traditional economicus sense, you had people who are working for you or servants, okay, what is just in how I treat them and what is their good and what does it mean for them to flourish? So it was a really important and kind of elevated type of work. Now, as we think about the more recent history of feminist thought, domestic work has kind of taken on this, I don't know, this valence where it's almost explicitly, like in the Victorian period, say, kind of reduced to women's work. It's okay, domestic work, that's the work of the home. Okay, but work, we're going to go out into the workplace, into public, into the political sphere and do this work. And that tension and dynamic causes a lot of discomfort, understandably, right? And throughout the recent history of thought here, there have been various ways that we've tried to deal with that. I think back to a poem in the Victorian period, The Angel of the House. It was by a pastor who was trying to sort of elevate the work of his wife. And he said, oh, she's so perfect. She's so gentle. She's so sensitive. If the flower dies, she cries at it. And he's trying to elevate and trying to appreciate the value of what she's doing. And yet, especially for the women thinkers who followed, this is the absolute worst way to try to elevate women's work, right? Virginia Woolf really famously said, the job of a writer, the job of a woman writer is in large part to kill the angel in the house, right? We need to get rid of this conception that limits women to having certain sort of characteristics and this kind of work being appropriate for them and not. Now, in the 70s and 80s, the way this showed up was, especially as a capitalist economy grew into what it is today, and the economy really took over kind of our working lives and then the sphere of our lives. The question became, how do we recognize the invisible labor that women overwhelmingly tend to do, right? You can't run a country or a factory if you don't have people who have been raised and are flourishing as humans. And yet, who do that, and again, statistically, especially historically, this tends to be overwhelmingly women. They're not given paychecks for that. They're not given like benefits for that. And yet the economy is just taking that as a given, as an assumption. So in the 70s, there was a movement called the wages for housework movement. And they said, okay, the thing we got to do is either start paying women who do this work, right? Or at least counting that work in the gross domestic product of the country. We got to recognize it, right? In doing this, we can kind of elevate this work using economic value, which is really the primary way that we think about value in the working world today. It's like, how much do you make? How much does your company bring in? What are the profits, et cetera? Now, there are various reactions to that, and I'll just mention one. So feminist thinkers at the time, when this movement was getting off the ground, they had a moment where they said, wait a second, if we start giving women wages for this type of work, that's actually going to lock them into a certain sort of lifestyle. We're actually going to be limiting them in a way. The real work that we've got to do in order to address inequalities between men and women is to figure out how to close gaps in the economy itself. So instead of focusing on childcare and recognizing it in a certain way, we need to find out what conditions are limiting women in the workplace, in the economy, and then address those things. The sort of domestic life stuff, they said, we're just going to have to figure that out in our private lives. They call it like job, family reconciliation, or figuring that out. Now, today, we see these debates continuing to live on, and we see the limits of some of these ways of thinking. There are still huge gaps between men and women in the workplace and the economy. And the explanations for those and what it would take to change that, those are all just fascinating moral, ethical, economic questions. And I just find that whole sort of history illuminating, especially when it comes to this question of just like work-life balance. How do we achieve that? Sorry, that was a monologue.
You were really going there, Paul. Yeah, and so as you were talking, a couple things are coming to mind for me. First was thinking about, I'm trying to remember if we've read together Bell Hook's essay on women at work, but it strikes me that it offers kind of not the same argument that you're making about kind of the limitations of this 1970s feminist movement that's like, we can't pay women because that will stick them in these drudgery roles and kind of devaluing in a way the work for an intrinsic sense that it could actually be meaningful to be in a household with children. But Bell Hook's argument was also that when feminists chose to make their focus like to liberation looks like get women out of the house, in fact, then they were overlooking that Black women and other women of color have in fact been out of working class women out of the house forever. Think about slavery and like this idea that if only women are not working in the house anymore, then they're liberated, just kind of shrunk who we were actually talking to with feminism. And so it seems to me that one of the arguments that Bell Hooks is making that I think would kind of dovetail with what you're saying too is that today feminism is reckoning with how do we allow to get back to your question about what makes work meaningful, how do we allow work to look meaningful in multiple different spheres? So that you can do work within the house and that's meaningful work, or you can do work outside the house and that's meaningful work. And also then how do we make feminism intersectional so that women of different classes, of different races, of different geographic locations, urban versus rural, all feel that their interests are represented. I don't know if you have thoughts in responding to that.
I think that's totally right and very interesting. I've read some Bell Hooks. I don't know that I've read that essay. The way that I would articulate it is I think a goal ought to be creating agency or creating the conditions for agency so that any person doesn't feel constrained or unreasonably constrained in the choices that they're making with respect to work and sort of personal life, family life, right? The other piece of it, though, is recognition, right? So there's the agency, there's the thing we're choosing to do, and then there's the status, like the way that it's viewed in society. And that's where I think the economic way of valuing things, the way that we just automatically, kind of sort people into status hierarchies in terms of what they do, how much money they make, how much power they have in an organization. That's where I think there's a lot of work to be done, because it doesn't seem like merely recognizing, oh, okay, if you've chosen to be at home, if you're a man or a woman, you are doing $80,000 worth of work a year. But that's not why you value it. And it's not why you want to do it. Is there a way of valuing, which I think would elevate the work and would increase the agency without reducing to these kind of economic terms?
Interesting. So in your mind, to include women's labor in the GDP or something like that would pose a threat towards it would act because you use the word reducing to the economic. Would you say that then if you offered in your mind this economic valuation of it, that would take away from this sense in which it's intrinsically meaningful that
That
you're dealing with?
That's a question I'm grappling with. And it's one that
Yeah.
I honestly just put to the women in the kind of focus group that I've assembled. So as I've been writing this book, this particular chapter relies heavily on a group of women that I met with regularly in my neighborhood. I kind of pretended to be an anthropologist for a bit. And I put the question to them. Now, my own view coming into it is it doesn't seem like assigning an economic sort of unit number to the contribution that a woman is making or a man is making and staying home and raising kids doesn't seem like that itself. It doesn't seem like that necessarily degrades the work, but it definitely doesn't seem like it fully captures the value, right? Let me give you an example. One of the women that I met with regularly as part of the chapter writing this book, one of the women, I asked her sort of point blank, I said, how much do you think your work is worth to you? Like at home? Is it worth like $100,000? Like someone said, I'll give you $100,000 to like do whatever else you want, but not do the work that you're doing at your home. She's like, no, not $100,000. I was like, okay, how about $500,000? Like a year? She's like, no, that's not right. And I was like, $1,000,000. She's like, I'm going to stop you there. There's no number, right? What that says to me is that, yes, there is like there's a way of measuring and capturing the value, the monetary, the economic value of what she does. And it's important, I think, to recognize that. And maybe including that in the GDP would be one way of recognizing it. But I don't think it fully captures the value, either the value that she's finding in this work, or the societal value, the value that's being generated, produced, right? And so I sometimes think if we focus too much on this question of should we assign economic sort of measure to domestic work and then count that in certain ways, that might be one way of recognizing, but it doesn't fully capture the value.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that, that, like, how do you how do you put a number on that? That beautiful feeling of raising a child, like, that 100% resonates with me. The question I'm thinking about, have you read, Caroline Criado Perez's Invisible Women? Definitely, you should 100% read this book, you'll love it. It's on the subtitle is something like gender something about the gender data gap in a world designed for men. But she has a chapter on women's labor in the GDP, and her argument is that this is not about kind of like rewarding women for their work or like helping them feel like, oh, yes, now someone understands that me doing this childcare is worth $100,000 or something, but rather is about this rising to the level of visibility for policymakers that, like, when policymakers are making decisions about, like, where to make cuts, they'll be like, "Oh, it looks like there's no cost if we just took
Mm,
away some of the public education funding," and it's, oh, in fact, what's happening then is that shifting those responsibilities into that unpaid, like, private sphere, domestic sphere, so that women end up carrying that burden more. And from a policy standpoint, it looks like we fixed that, nothing's lost. But in fact, and she shows the data about how that pulls women out of the workforce, and then that in fact costs the country and such in other ways. And so her argument was factoring women's labor into the GDP, and this isn't the whole of the argument, I'm oversimplifying, but is in her mind a good thing for raising to the level of policy, helping people make like social infrastructure decisions that benefit the countries in the long run.
I love that. And I'm definitely going to look this up. And
I think you would like it.
I think from how you've described it, I think I'm convinced. I think like that argument, right? And so again, if the question is, should we count domestic work in the GDP? Maybe the answer is yeah, for that purpose, right? The purpose of creating policies that are fair and that sort of make visible all the work that's happening in our society, in our economy. If the question is, should that be the only or primary way that we value work in the domestic sphere? I think the answer there is no, definitely not.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I think, I don't know, this question sounds similar. Like, why should we change? I think a lot hangs on it. I really do. I think articulating this value, societal value, sort of individual value, is really important for the way that we relate to others in our community, to others in our lives, the way that we see other people and recognize them. So even though they might seem like really similar questions, I do think that there's an important distinction between them.
Oh, absolutely. And I think too, there's a bit of a chicken and an egg. I know the Sheedy students and us will have this conversation about it is in some ways easier, even though it seems maybe impossible in like our gridlocked political system. It's in some ways easier to change the policy or to change the like numbers, the dollars, whatever, as opposed to changing cultural assumptions or societal norms. How do you change people's minds about things? And in some ways, it's like how you can't change policies until you change people's minds, and then vice versa until the policy's in place. So
one just to give an example of this, one example here that I find interesting is this question of like child tax credits, right? Now, people on like the left and people on the right often support something like a child tax credits for very different reasons, right? And yet when you then try to have a conversation, it gets really difficult. We need sort of language that allows us to communicate, right? Because often the discourse then blocks any sort of policy progress we could make. I'm not going to support that because it was put forward by that person. And you're like, so one goal of mine is just in exploring these issues, trying to articulate kind of a conceptual framework or at least enough pieces that we can have those conversations like person to person in a way that gets us out of some of the kind of ideological ruts that we all find ourselves in.
Yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. I feel like I could talk to you about this for like hours. And I've, in some ways, I think derailed us by being like, start talking about politics and the GDP. But I do want to think about, you're a philosopher, and that's your interest in these questions as a philosopher. Like you mentioned, as a philosopher, those two questions that might seem very similar are in fact, you can see the distinction, and that's cool. And so I want to draw upon that knowledge, specialized expertise that you have in this conversation. And one of the ways that I thought we could do that on this episode is to talk through for audiences texts that we've taught together, Dr. Andrea Veltman's Meaningful Work. It's a book. We've taught a selection from a chapter of it. And Dr. Veltman's a professor of philosophy at James Madison University for the audiences. And so I thought maybe we could just talk through for audiences a little bit about what we've liked about this article, what we have learned from it, and like kind of how it's helped us and students think through what makes work meaningful. Since, that's kind of at the heart of this conversation we're having. Is that if I could just to that?
Right.
Okay, listeners, Dr. Veltman's essay, she lays out 4 different dimensions of meaningful work, or in other words, 4 different ways that you could understand work to be meaningful. And this is one of the things that's kind of a hallmark of this essay and that we find so helpful about it is that it is a pluralistic account of meaningful work. She's not saying, if you just, this is the one thing, but rather work could be meaningful along this dimension or along this dimension, and sees how they interact with one another. So I thought for our purposes today, I would read off the dimension from Dr. Veltman, and then Paul, maybe you can give like an example of it for people to kind of help people understand what that means. Does that sound
Yeah, that sounds great. And maybe just as a very brief sort of framing
yeah.
thought, it's somewhat important, I think, to remember that Veltman is working within a virtue ethics sort of framework or perspective, which I think is like true, and it's like the right perspective.
Yeah, correct is always yeah.
Um, but I say that in part because it helps explain these kind of different dimensions of meaning that she's identifying, right? So she's going to emphasize virtue. Okay, why would you care about that? Or capabilities? Why would you care about that? It's because she's got this view on which human beings are a kind of thing. There's certain ways that we flourish, and there's certain ways that sort of certain things that keep us from flourishing. And she wants to articulate, okay, with respect to work, what are some of the ways that we can flourish in work versus be frustrated or oppressed by our work?
Great background. Very helpful. Thank you, Paul. Okay, 4 ways that she says then that work helps you can flourish at work. Way number 1, the work lets you develop or exercise your human capabilities, such as intelligence or autonomy, especially insofar as others recognize or value you doing it.
This is great. So, what is a human capability or a human capacity? This goes all the way back to Aristotle, who's asking questions about what kind of a thing are we, right? What differentiates us from other animals, right? Aristotle characterizes us as the rational animal, right? So, distinctly human capacities or capabilities. This is a really broad sort of range of things. It can be creativity, or it can be rationality, or it can be social relationship building. It could be so, but these are what I would describe as like the distinctively human capabilities, right? Okay, so work is meaningful when it develops or exercises this. Again, it's lovely because you can look at just any different industry or any different sort of career path and think about what human capabilities does this cultivate and develop. An investment banker is going to be cultivating and developing sort of strategic capacities, economic in the classic sense, where there's goods, we can measure them, we can distribute them, we can see what's going to be better for this company or this person, whatever. Those are very sort of human capabilities, right? And engaging those and being recognized for doing that is a good thing. It's meaningful to us. Just to take a radically different example, the artist, right? Who's creating something with some intention, some sort of desire, wants it to either have an effect, whatever, creating this thing and being recognized for creating this thing. They're developing this sort of capacity, this capability, this distinctively human capability. Now, again, I think you can apply that to many different types of work. And I think it's just intuitively something that we often value about our work. I love teaching because it allows me to think and to think in community with people. It's crazy that I get paid to do that, right? But that's developing a distinctively human capability.
Cool. Okay, number 2, the work supports you in developing virtues, including self-respect, honor, integrity, dignity, or pride.
Here, you can think of all kinds of ways in which work develops virtues. Think about a carpenter who's got to practice over and over to get the dimensions just right or to make sure that the table is whatever. This is developing a kind of patience, a kind of attentiveness, really like a sort of love for the form of this thing and for the people who will eventually use it. Take a different example, somebody who is working for a nonprofit. They're cultivating a kind of empathy for the people that they serve and a way of communicating to the people who they want to donate and bring into that community and connect. These are all virtues, right? And you can break them down to be simple. Okay, patience, attentiveness, love, empathy. But those are the kinds of things. Those are the opportunities that work sometimes gives us a chance to cultivate.
Cool. Yeah. So work is meaningful if it helps us cultivate those virtues.
Totally.
Okay, here's number 3. The work provides you with a personal sense of purpose or fulfills a genuinely useful purpose for others, especially something with enduring value.
Purpose is one of these tricky words. We often use it in the context of talking about work. Oh, I want purposeful work, or I want to feel like I have a purpose. And it can be tricky to really figure out what that means. Here, I think what she's saying is we know what it means to feel like we have purpose in our lives or our work. And we know what it feels like not to have that, right? Like, why am I doing this? Doesn't matter at all. And so that feeling of purposefulness is really important. And that's something that makes your work meaningful, right? But also the purpose you're genuinely serving. So I can imagine cases where these come apart, right? I realize, look, I am an essential piece of a huge puzzle that serves a bunch of people, saves lives, whatever. I don't find a lot of sort of purpose feeling in it. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm counting the data, or I don't know but I do recognize, man, this is really important. And people recognize that you're doing something really important. So I think there it's either or both of those. Ideally, they kind of overlap so that you're feeling the purpose and you're being recognized as doing something that serves a greater purpose. But I think that's how I would cash out or explain that condition.
Yeah, neat. Okay, and last but not least, the fourth one, the work helps you integrate different elements of your life, such as helping you build personal relationships you care about or connecting you to an environment or context that is important to your identity.
Yeah. So this, I think, is actually the hardest dimension
Yeah.
to realize or achieve in our contemporary world, our contemporary society, for various reasons. But think about the person for whom achieving a kind of professional goal is just, that's their life's work. That's what they do. That's what they want to do. I want to be in this kind of a position, right? Their whole life can kind of be organized around that work. Now, you can take that too far. Maybe that gets unhealthy at a certain point. Or just consider in a more simple case, I'm a teacher. Being a teacher is not just what I do, it's part of my identity. It's how I see myself, how I relate to the world. And that integrates, brings together different spheres of life, different arenas in a way that's not always true of work, right? So take the opposite sort of example when this is not working well, you get alienation. So just think of Marx's classic sort of depiction of the worker in the factory who's doing something that like a machine could do, but they're being required to do this 12 hours a day and they're just moving this thing up and down. In that case, you might think, look, this is alienating me. It's taking me away from, I don't identify as like a lever puller. I don't love this. I don't see the kind of purpose in this. And one of the great sort of harms or dangers of work is that it can disintegrate us, right? And I think we all have feelings like that. You're sometimes sitting, doing some part of your job and just thinking, why am I doing this? It's not serving any good. It's not what, so that's a dimension where, again, things can go really well, things can go poorly.
Yeah, I think that last dimension, like you said, it seems to me tricky both in terms of how to understand it and probably implementing it. But in the thinking about the context of women's work then or care work, one of the things that I really appreciate about Veltman is that she uses care work as an example multiple times as she's talking about meaningful work. It's not invisible for her in ways that often when people are philosophizing about work, maybe it's a generalization, but that's not the first go-to example. And so that's one of the things I really like about this essay. But she seems to draw out or use these dimensions of work to help explain why care work can feel just absolutely infuriating in some contexts and frustrating and mind numbing and so meaningful and beautiful and invaluable, like can't put a number on it, invaluable in other contexts. It seems like it has a lot to do with this. Is it helping you build a personal relationship you care about in an environment that's important to your identity? Did you, sorry.
Absolutely. I would just describe that. I would just kind of link this back to this notion or idea of agency, right? And I think so much of the way we evaluate our work, whether it's we think it's frustrating or it's really elevating, sort of life-giving, comes down to this question of agency. Like, why am I doing what I'm doing in this context? And how is it being recognized or evaluated by people outside of this context? And there, I think you're right. Bringing up care work as an example is perfect because there are just so many different ways, so many different feelings that we can have towards some particular kind of care work. It's like the same instance of an action, maybe just like me picking up the house after my kids. It feel oppressive. It can feel useful, or it can feel like an act of love and generosity. And I think a lot of the sort of what determines how it feels, a lot of times comes down to, or is at least importantly influenced by agency. Am I stuck doing this? Am I forced to do this? Do I want to do this? So I think it's just a great thing to focus on. And you're right. It was a generality to say philosophers don't think about this kind of work. A true generality. It's a true one. We really don't.
Yeah, I think agency is a really great variable to think about. It also makes me think about, I think she mentions as another variable is who's on the receiving end and are they capable of doing it themselves? Like how much agency do they have? She uses, you did picking up the house. I think washing dishes was one of the examples she uses and kind of contrasts washing dishes for an aging parent who no longer is able to manage everything around the house and the quiet meaning that could have versus washing dishes at a restaurant where you're underpaid and your boss is yelling at you versus the experience of washing dishes for your 17-year-old kid where you're like, "You wash your own. Why don't you just put the plate in the sink? Is this so hard to understand?" Like,
Totally.
you're doing the same action,
No,
but the feeling that you have or one of those feels meaningful and two of them do not. And so what are the variables that are at play? And that's where, again, those 4 dimensions of work I think are so useful. Because if you're like, "Why do I feel like this is not meaningful?" To have someone to a way to think through, a tool for thinking through, "Okay, why not? What boxes is it not checking that could and then is there something I could do to make it meaningful? Or do I need to find a way to either set stronger boundaries or stand up for myself or get out of this situation?" Yeah.
totally. I think that's right. And let me just add 2 more scenarios. I love the washing dishes example that you're using. The aging parent, potentially say sort of control for the other variables, meaningful. This is sort of integrating, elevating. It feels like a genuine act of love and agency. Okay, the dishes, like in the restaurant, you're oppressed. Okay. And then I love the 17-year-old example. Here's another one, doing the dishes so that my wife can be out working. Think like doing the dishes so my wife can be out working. I think there's really important ways in which that could be agency building for me, or oppressive for me. If I think she's out working because, man, she's just like money hungry. She just wants money. And it doesn't matter at the end of the day. I would rather that she's here, like doing the dishes with me, that we're doing this together, right? That would feel oppressive. On the other hand, if I'm like, man, I'm doing this because I see her as having this goal, this sort of part of her identity being built up by this work, and I want to see her flourish in that way, right? Then it takes on a very different feel, even though in any of these cases, doing the dishes is pretty toilsome.
Yeah, absolutely. And it strikes me too, the first dimension that mentioned, especially in the case of recognition by others, if when
Yes.
your spouse came home, she did not notice that you had done the dishes and did not care, you
Right.
would probably feel more oppressed doing it the next time than if it was like, "Wow, thank you so much for doing the dishes." It really felt it was nice that I could be out doing my whatever.
Absolutely. And build that recognition out. Do we have cultural or social ways of appreciating that? Because you come in and it's a basic assumption that you take care of all this stuff and I get to do meaningful, important things or something. So like the personal recognition, like me saying, oh yeah, okay, or my wife coming home and saying, oh, thanks for doing this. Okay, very important. And the cultural sort of recognition, the ways that she can express that sort of gratitude, also very important, right? Yeah, yes.
That's
Well, not
yeah.
your
In sum, great article. Thank you, Dr. Andrea Feldman. We really like it. If you're listening to this.
yeah, absolutely.
We're fans. The last thing I wanted us to do, we should probably transition to this, not forever long of a podcast, is to talk. You mentioned in that when you're doing the working life course, one of the goals as the course develops more is to help students put pressure on some of the assumptions that in Western culture we kind of take for granted about what it means to be successful, what it means to achieve things, what it, like a good life in a working professional sense looks like. And I think feminist philosophers' work are really helpful in kind of recognizing those assumptions and thinking, what else is there? What are the alternatives? And so I thought maybe we could talk through a little bit about that in the context, though, of a story, because I like literature. That's my thing. And this series is about literature in part. I thought it could be a cool ending place. And the story that I wanted to talk about is Ursula Le Guin's Sir, which was first published in The New Yorker in 1982. I'm trying to remember, have you read this story, Paul?
I honestly printed it out when you talked about it, and I read half of it, and maybe fittingly, I fell asleep with my baby in my arm. I read part of it, and I loved it.
Folks, that is a comment on parenting, not on how good this story is. You should read the story. Parenting is very difficult, and sleep.
I was riveted and very sleep deprived.
Yes, correct. Good. I'll give you audience members a summary, Paul, a summary for you. It's an interesting, I love this piece. It's interesting. It's a speculative history, which means that it's imagining a historical event as if it has happened. In this case, the event that it's imagining is the discovery of the South Pole, the first expedition to the South Pole. So the story reads as a summary of an expedition that it's written in the first person and that using I. So the narrator has written this, as she puts it, with the hope that her grandchild or somebody's grandchild will someday find this account that she's written. But she puts it in an old attic trunk. And the idea is not that it's found right away, but that several generations from now, someone will uncover this and find it interesting. So we're reading this account that she's written. In the story, the narrator and 8 other women, all from South America, decide that they want to see Antarctica. And while they're there, they then journey arduously, painfully, it's hard to read at times, to the South Pole. And in this speculative history, their journey is taking place in 1909. So at this point, there have been other crews that have attempted to get to the South Pole, but have not been successful. The story references one like 1907. As this story is speculating history, these group of 9 women, and there's like a small subset of them that actually reach the South Pole, they're the first ones to reach the South Pole successfully. And then, and this is where the story gets interesting, they just decide not to tell anyone. So in this critical moment in the story where these 3 women have made it to the South Pole and they can't even smile because their lips are frozen. And then they say, this is the quote, "We discussed leaving some kind of mark or monument, a tent pole or a flag, but there seemed no particular reason to do. Anything we could do, anything we were, was insignificant in that awful place." And so they leave without a trace. And so on the one hand, it's like their decision not to leave anything behind, to show no sign that they've gone, is motivated by, I guess you'd say, like the existential threat of the South Pole itself. So like they're in this place that's like, the sublime is the one that comes to mind. Awesome to the point of being terrifying. One of my other favorite lines says something like, "Achievement is smaller than men think. What is large is the sky, the earth, the sea, the soul." So it's like this reckoning with achievement. On the other hand, and this part is harder for me to interpret, and definitely students too, they seem to have also a concern for protecting the egos of men who will come after them and want to find the South Pole. So she says something like, "I was glad," is another quote. Let me see if I can find it here. Quote, "I was glad even then that we had left no sign there. For some man longing to be the first might come someday and find it, and know then what a fool he had been and break his heart." So there's these multiple reasons, potentially, but moral of the story, women find South Pole, they decide to say nothing. As a philosopher of work, Paul, what do you find interesting about this? Or what is coming to mind as I'm describing this?
I love this. And go home and just read the rest of it right away. A couple of things are coming to mind. So one is an appreciation for how our activities, actions, work as humans, how it relates to a greater whole. So you were describing this feeling of the sublime, or this kind of recognition. I love that. I love that quote about achievement. I think that is something that you find in philosophers, in sort of wisdom traditions. You find this reorienting perspective of you're striving for this thing, to achieve this thing. This is your goal. And yet, and it's fine and it's good that you're achieving this thing. And yet, like your actions, right? Your achievement really, in the grand scheme of things, if anything, it represents a connection to the grand scheme of things and how much more beauty and value there is in this sort of grander scheme of things. So it makes me think, honestly, of book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle talks about contemplation as being the thing humans can do that is most godlike, the thing that we've got to strive to do with every fiber of our being. And yet it's an activity that is inherently frustrating for us because we just can't achieve that perspective at the end of the day. But we should always strive to kind of get that. I think that's amazing. I think that's beautiful. The other thing that is just really striking to me is this second sort of reason, right? To fail to leave any marker to protect the ego of a man. Now, when you read the quote, you said something like that a man in the future is going to come and suppose he sees a flag here, will realize what a fool he is, and then it will break his heart. Now, implied by that is that he is a fool, regardless of whether or not he realizes it and whether or not it breaks his heart. And I think that's like a provocative and also just insightful recognition that we can do work, we can try to achieve things for very different reasons. And I think the danger in achievement, or the danger in what I've come to call like achievementism, this kind of work ethic of our time, is that we see the achievement as entirely our own and as the ultimate purpose, the point, right? So I want to be the CEO of this company. And I get there and I say, I did this. I did it on my own. I worked hard and got this. And this is what I wanted. Now, anybody who's achieved anything, right, of significance in their life that they had to work for months or years on realizes that's a myth. You never get there. You never get in that position and think, all right, that's it. Like, I've done it. You always think, I'm missing something. There's something else here. I'm missing something. And so to me, what's interesting about this is that it reflects on the intentions of this band of explorers. They're exploring in like a genuine sense to encounter, to see, to discover. And this allows them to take out any sort of external sort of, like fame, fortune, like whatever. And it really kind of preserves the purity of that intention. Now, you could have both. You could be like, okay, I did it not for the recognition, but because like I wanted to, and the recognition is good. And I think that's often how we think. But I think when you do something in secret, you do some good in secret, I think a big motivating factor for keeping it secret is often that like it preserves the purity of that intention, and it allows you even to appreciate and to recognize that your intention was for the discovery, for the whatever, and not the recognition. It's impossible to be motivated or to read your sort of life's history as being motivated by a desire for status, power, money, wealth, fame, if nobody knows about it. And if you intentionally chose not to tell anybody about it. Cool. I love that.
Yeah. Oh, I love it too. I feel like when I teach this, I'll often teach it alongside the Man on the Moon speech. The idea of the plant the flag, we're the first, you do it, you so excited. And this counter way of thinking about it, there is a line, what you were saying about for the sake of the actual genuine exploration, where they say we came to see, no more nor less. And I think too, to your point about they're calling the man a fool, you're right. And there's those lines happen in the same paragraph where the narrator says, I wish we hadn't gone. Even now, looking back, I wish we hadn't gone. And the difficulty of the task and kind of realizing that it was reckless, I think, in that moment. So it flies in the face of our then hoping that the narrators, if they're not going to plant the flag, at least have this romantic narrative of, but I overcame all difficulty, and like it sparked this alive desire for exploration. And now I'll try for the North Pole. No, she is, wow, that was really hard and bad, and like we probably went too far. We shouldn't have done it, but here we did. And I do want my grandchildren or something to have the record. So there's a sense in which absolutely she's shaped by it. But yeah, it's like a sense of interest in journey or exploration or seeing without exactly with any of the focus on achievement or plant your flag.
I love that.
Yes. Now, students are so mad when I've taught this in the past. I've taught this twice before. I almost was like, I shouldn't teach it again, but nope, I'm doing it again. And so I'll see what they think this semester. But students have been so mad when we read it. I'd be curious, Paul, do you have a sense? You said you could instantly kind of imagine why that would be the case. But so why do you think students are so mad when we read this story?
I think, I mean, for one thing, I think our students' default sort of work ethic is achievementism. I think we've just hammered it into them. And I think part of that just manifests in being extrinsically motivated to the point where you don't really cultivate fully the virtues or capacities to be intrinsically motivated for something, right? So we start seeing the goal as an end in itself rather than part of a whole life's journey or something, right? So my guess would be from the student's point of view, if I'm right about this kind of achievementism that is seeped into all of our lives, not just our students,
Oh,
but all of
absolutely.
ours, this challenges that. This goes against that. It's almost unintelligible if you're assuming that like the achievement, the recognition, the fame, the whatever, that's the point. I think makes you uncomfortable, right? Because then you have to ask all these questions about, was that the point? Why? So that would be my guess. I think that would be one part of my guess. The other part is the gender dynamic.
Totally.
In a way, you could read the narrator as saying, men and their egos and the way they work and why they're working, etc. This is kind of an indictment of the way that many men work and explorers and whatever. And to me, that seems like history. But anytime you have some sort of like generalization about men do this or women do, and then to put it in the context of this kind of exploring and recognition and work, that I just think is always going to challenge us, in part because it's just such a controversial kind of area. Like it's just a hard thing to talk about without just inadvertently raising these great feelings in the people that you're talking to. And so my guess is it really, I think some of the discomfort really comes from the fact that we don't have just a clear culturally accepted just mode where we're like, this is how we interpret the gender aspect of this. We really don't. It's something we would have to talk and think really hard about, but it's a scary area to go to.
Totally. Yeah, that's so true. And I think too, another thing that's come out is on the one hand, you could read this story, and this is how I read it, which is I think why I like it so much, is kind of a feminist pushback against achievementism as a measure of what success looks like. On the other hand, you could read it as like a sort of the women anti-feminist capitulating to demands on women to just keep quiet and not speak too loudly, not stand up for themselves. I think sometimes students are mad because they really want like a hashtag girl boss ending where
Mhm.
these women like plant their flag and then publish their thing and they're getting the credit and yeah, aha, women have done it. They went to the South Pole first. And the fact that the women choose not to do that can seem in their mind like they're just giving in to cultural pressure that says women should keep quiet, that women should stay at home. So I think that factors in too.
It's so interesting to me that decision to keep secret the fact that they discovered it, in a way, contributes to this sort of agency that they have in this really uncomfortable way. So I think there are ways of writing this story where it's very clearly a capitulation to the culture. And again, it's more comfortable to read a story like that because there's kind of black and white moral terms. You're like, oh, so bad. They're so oppressed. There's a way to read it where it's a complete sort of indictment of a certain way of approaching work and exploration. Again, kind of comfortable. This is like the middle way where by keeping something secret, you're preserving a kind of intentionality and agency in the face of all these cultural dynamics that are going on, like at a particular time. That's just fascinating. That's just, it's incredible.
Yeah, Ursula Le Guin, I just feel like she's a genius. I love her writing in this story. To me, for exactly the reasons you're saying, you can't nail it down to one interpretation, and those kinds of stories then are often my favorite because they just haunt me. I think about it and I question it, and I love doing that with students in the classroom too, because there's just so much to talk about.
Totally. I would just add too, in case anybody's interested, I love the practice of reading short stories or novels, but mostly short stories in my classes. I think with respect to work, these kind of stories, this kind of speculative fiction, whether it's speculative historical fiction or I use George Saunders in my class, and he often writes about kind of the near future. It's not at all science fiction because none of the technologies are explained or interesting even, but just like speculatively, just taking us far enough outside the kind of current sort of economic system and relationships to work, et cetera. And then telling us a story about a person and how they feel, what they understand or don't. It can be just so illuminating. It can just break the categories that we're so used to using in relating to our work in a way that, again, then causes that kind of really productive tension, I think, and discomfort where got to think through some things. Yeah.
Yep. Literature.
Yeah. Love
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. I want to ask you one more question kind of to close. So writers, authors, philosophers are offering these pluralistic accounts of meaningful work and challenging traditional definitions of what success looks like or what achievement looks like. Why should we care? Like, why should listeners or audiences care about that?
I'm going to go back to the answer that always motivates me when I'm doing philosophy. And that is that thinking about these questions can determine whether our lives go well or poorly, like whether we flourish or don't at the end of the day. So for me, and this isn't the sort of goal of all philosophy, but certainly practical virtue ethics type philosophy, you're always asking, am I living well? Am I a good person? Or am I on the way to being a good person? And so when it comes to questions of meaningfulness and work, it's such a tangled sort of area. And there's so many cultural assumptions and things that we've got to sort through, achievementism, et cetera, that it becomes, work becomes one of the most important sort of theaters in which our lives play out, are lived. And it's really important to make sure that you are kind of directing things, that you're the agent, that things are lining up in the way that you want them to. So just to make this more concrete, I know as a philosopher, I'm like, okay, if we're motivated by a kind of achievementism, a kind of extrinsic, motivation, I want to achieve this thing and then I'm going to be happy. We all know that's not true. It doesn't work. But if we uncritically just kind of accept that and allow that to direct our decisions and pull us into a working life at the expense of other areas of our lives that we could find important and meaningful, you could live a tragic story. You could get to the end of it and look back and just think, why did I do that? It meant nothing, right? And for me, that's like the scariest thing ever, right? To be in a position where you look back and you just think like, I didn't live well. I didn't live up to my values and standards. If you critically engage this stuff, wrestle with it, think about it, read the stories, think about the arguments maybe a little bit, I think you're much more likely to cultivate like a health, like an intellectual health, a moral health where, no matter where your life goes and how it goes, as you mature and grow, you're a lot less likely to be the kind of person that looks back and just says like, I know what I was doing. I didn't mean to do these things. I ignored important aspects of my life. And so for me, like that's flourishing, right? And that's how the kind of critical thinking, consideration, reading, discussion, conversation, dialogue, that's where those skills and activities, they really just pay off, is in cultivating this kind of healthy, sort of flourishing state.
That feels like a good note to end on. Thanks so much, Paul. As always, a real pleasure to talk with you. And audiences, thank you too for joining us for this episode of Women's Work. On behalf of me, Paul, ND Women Connect and Think ND, we really hope you enjoyed this conversation and we'll visit think.nd.edu to learn even more. Until next time, inspire your mind and spark conversations.